Oyster shells into Charlotte Harbor today to help boost water quality and help our fish and anglers.
Florida dropped 500,000 tons of oyster shells into the Gulf of Mexico. What grew back has researchers at a loss for words. These weren't precision-placed materials guided by an engineering master plan. They were table scraps, shells pried off steam pots and shoveled out of processing plants, loaded onto barges, and tipped overboard into Gulf waters off the Florida coast between 2007 and 2024. No one anticipated anything worth writing home about. Environmental critics labeled it ocean dumping with a conservation label slapped on top. Commercial fishermen who had worked those waters for generations warned it would finish off what little remained of Florida's battered coastal floor. Even the scientists who designed the program expected they might be presiding over an expensive failure. But something began happening on that Gulf seafloor that defied every prediction, every timeline, and every assumption about the pace at which nature recovers. A stretch of dead ocean bottom started waking up, not gradually, not after years of careful monitoring, faster, denser, and more structurally complex than any model had suggested was possible. What took shape down there wasn't simply a reef. It was a living system, and it's still expanding today. Here's exactly how it happened and why it will change the way you think about the ocean forever. The experiment nobody believed between 2007 and 2024, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission ran one of the most contested coastal experiments in the state's history. The premise sounds almost too simple to take seriously. Collect discarded oyster shells from restaurants and seafood processing facilities scattered across Florida. Truck them to the coast, load them onto barges, dump them into the Gulf of Mexico near Cedar Key. More than 500,000 tons of them. The backlash was instant, and it came from multiple directions. Environmental organizations called it a disposal operation dressed up in conservation language. They argued those shells would smother whatever fragile biological communities were still clinging to life on the soft, sandy seafloor beneath. Coastal fishermen who had spent lifetimes reading those waters, families who understood every current and every seasonal pattern, feared sediment disruption, collapse, music, fish habitats, and permanent damage to the fishing grounds their livelihoods depended on. The opposition wasn't fringe. It was organized, credible, and driven by genuine ecological concern from people who knew these waters intimately. And still, the commission moved forward. Their logic was blunt. Those shells were going to landfills regardless. If there was a meaningful chance they could function as substrate for a damaged reef system, running the experiment was worth the political cost. Here's the part that most accounts leave out. Nobody, not the program's architects, not the marine biologists reviewing the proposal, not the fisheries managers who signed off on it, actually expected things to move this quickly. When the first monitoring teams returned to the deposition sites 18 months after the initial shell drops, they were bracing for the data to confirm what the skeptics had been saying all along. What they found instead stopped Dr. Krimsky, a shellfish habitat specialist with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, mid-sentence during a team debrief. Life was colonizing the shell mounds. Not 2 years in, not 3 years in, which is the standard minimum timeline for any detectable biological response from an artificial reef project in months. Clusters of marine organisms were forming at rates that had no equivalent anywhere in the existing scientific literature. The shells weren't behaving like passive debris on the seafloor. They were functioning as biological triggers, kickstarting processes that the surrounding environment had no mechanism to initiate on its own. And nobody could fully account for why it was happening so fast. To find that answer, you had to look at something so small, it was essentially invisible to the naked eye. What was unfolding down there was stranger than anyone had imagined. The invisible phase, microlife that rebuilt an ecosystem. The first colonizers weren't fish. They weren't oysters. They weren't anything you could see from a research vessel. They were bacteria. Within days of the shells settling onto the seafloor, microscopic bacterial communities began moving across the calcium carbonate surfaces, forming thin biofilms, structured living carpets that transform an inert shell into functional microhabitat. These weren't random scatterings of microorganisms. They were organized biological infrastructure, laying a foundation that everything else would eventually build on. And the shells themselves were doing something nobody had fully anticipated. Oyster shells are composed primarily of aragonite, a crystalline form of calcium carbonate that dissolves slowly when submerged in seawater. As those shells began releasing calcium ions into the surrounding water, they generated tiny localized alkaline zones, microscopic chemical environments embedded in the broader Gulf chemistry. Those shifts in local chemistry were precisely what calcifying organisms need to attach and begin growing. Barnacles, tube worms, juvenile oysters, organisms that require a very specific chemical handshake before they'll commit to a surface. The shells were manufacturing that handshake. They weren't just providing physical structure. They were engineering the conditions for their own colonization. Weeks later, diatoms and microalgae moved into those established biofilms, laying down the base layer of a rudimentary food web. Microscopic crustaceans and larval mollusks followed, grazing the algae. Those grazers drew the first juvenile fish. Each biological stage fed directly into the next, a self-reinforcing cycle building itself out of discarded seafood scraps on the dark floor of the Gulf. Here's why that matters at a fundamental level. Sandy seabeds cannot do this. Sand offers no attachment surface for biofilm formation, no chemical microzones, no structural complexity of any kind. Florida's soft-bottom Gulf floor had been biologically stuck in a kind of ecological dead end. The shells bypassed that dead end entirely. By the end of the first 6 months, the shell surfaces were layered in biofilm and microalgae. To anyone watching from above or even diving the sites, they looked like failure. A pile of old shells sitting on a flat seafloor, slowly going gray. But Dr. Krimsky's water samples and sediment cores told a completely different story. In less time than most traditional artificial reef projects show any measurable biological response at all, the shell deposits had established a complete, functioning, microscopic ecosystem. The invisible phase was the hidden scaffolding. Without the bacteria, without the aragonite chemistry, without the biofilm feeding the first wave of grazers, there is no reef. There is only calcium on sand. The scaffolding was already in place. And what came next made the scientists question everything they thought they understood about how reefs form. The return of the reef builders. Oysters require hard surfaces to survive. That single biological constraint had been quietly strangling Florida's Gulf Coast for decades, and most people never knew it was happening. Oyster larvae, called spat, drift through the current searching for substrate. In a healthy reef system, that substrate is the accumulated shell mass of previous generations. Centuries of dead oysters layered into a dense, complex platform that filters water, buffers erosion, and supports an estimated 300 distinct species. But Florida's natural reef systems had been gutted. Overharvesting, pollution, coastal development, and the resulting runoff had progressively dismantled a reef network that once covered hundreds of square miles of Gulf floor. By the early 2000s, spat were drifting through open water with almost nowhere to land. No substrate, no settlement, no new oysters. The reproductive cycle had broken down. The Gulf had no internal mechanism to repair itself. The dumped shells solved that bottleneck almost immediately. Each shell mound was a concentrated landing zone, positioned, sometimes by design, sometimes by the logic of Gulf currents, exactly where drifting spat would travel. Within the first year, Dr. Bill Pine, a marine researcher at the University of Florida Marine Lab, documented juvenile oysters attaching to the deposited shells in numbers that significantly exceeded program projections. The larvae were finding surface. They were settling. They were beginning to grow. By year 2, those juveniles were reproductive adults. They were generating larvae of their own. That second generation settled on the existing reef structure and extended it further. Human hands had created the initial conditions. Nature had taken over the rest completely. Here's what the data showed by year 3. Monitoring surveys recorded an average of 847 oysters per cubic meter of deposited shells. Nearby soft bottom areas with no substrate supported virtually zero. The reefs were no longer confined to the original footprint of the shell drops either. Oysters were dying naturally, contributing their own shells to the structure, providing substrate for the next wave of settlement. Vertical growth, horizontal expansion. The reef was constructing itself. And then came the moment that changed the entire public conversation around the program. Charter Captain Mike Lenz had been among the loudest and most persistent voices opposing the shell deposition effort from the beginning. He had testified against it before state bodies. He had warned publicly that it would destroy fishing grounds his family had worked for 3 generations. In 2013, standing at the rail of his boat over one of the established reef sites, Lenz watched a thick school of redfish holding in the current around a shell mound. He said something he hadn't planned to say. "I was wrong. I've never seen fish stack up like that in 25 years on this water." That reversal wasn't just one man changing his mind. It was the moment the scientific findings and the lived experience of people who had fished those waters their entire lives finally lined up. And the fish were only the beginning of what these reefs were about to do. When the fish arrived, everything changed. Reef fish don't wait for formal announcements. The instant structural complexity appears on a featureless seafloor, they locate it. Within 2 years of the Cedar Key reefs establishing themselves, fish surveys were returning numbers that made Dr. Pine's team go back and verify their methodology from scratch. Biomass around the reef sites had increased by more than 340% compared to control areas of similar size. Species diversity was up 280%. Here's the detail that separates this from a typical aggregation effect. These weren't fish that had relocated from somewhere else in the Gulf, drawn to a new landmark. The primary driver of the increase was juvenile fish, animals born in those waters and surviving to maturity there. The reefs weren't concentrating an existing population. They were producing life that hadn't existed in those waters before. Redfish arrived first, working the complex shell structure to feed and find cover from predators. Sheepshead followed, thriving on the invertebrate communities that had taken hold across every hard surface. Flounder worked the reef edges. Snook appeared in numbers that hadn't been documented in those waters in years. And Mike Lenz wasn't the only captain who reversed course. Charter operators across the Cedar Key area began formally requesting new reef sites near their most used fishing grounds from the exact same commission they had fought in court 6 years earlier. Hotels, bait shops, and waterfront restaurants all reported measurable revenue increases directly tied to the marine activity around the reef sites. The ecological cascade continued moving up the food chain. Octopuses established territories in the reef's complex gaps and overhangs. Sea turtles returned and began foraging on the invertebrate communities coating the shells. Dolphins were observed hunting systematically at reef edges, working the dense fish concentrations in coordinated passes. Every new arrival reinforced the trophic structure beneath it. The system was becoming more complex, more stable, and more biologically resilient with each passing season. What made this ecologically significant, rather than just visually impressive, was a distinction Dr. Pine's team worked carefully to establish in the published record. Artificial reefs made of concrete structures or sunken ships are historically effective at concentrating fish that already occupy an area, redistributing an existing population around a new geographic landmark that can produce dramatic survey numbers without representing any real increase in marine life. You move fish, not create them. The Cedar Key reefs were doing something different. Juvenile fish counts were the primary driver of the biomass increase. The reefs were generating fish, creating the survival conditions that hadn't previously existed in that ecosystem. That distinction mattered enormously for how Florida's fisheries managers thought about expanding the program. But fish were only part of what was happening. Something else was changing in the water itself. Something no model had predicted. Something with consequences reaching far beyond the reef footprint. The billion-gallon machines that kept building a single adult oyster filters between 30 and 50 gallons of seawater every day. Run that number across hundreds of thousands of oysters thriving across the restored reef sites. Entire reef systems were processing billions of gallons of Gulf water daily, pulling out suspended particles, excess nutrients, harmful bacteria, and agricultural runoff. No machinery, no electrical infrastructure, no maintenance budget. Nature had constructed an industrial-scale water treatment operation out of discarded restaurant waste. The Gulf Coast has a chronic nutrient pollution problem defining its degraded condition for decades. Nitrogen and phosphorus from agricultural operations and urban development pour continuously into coastal waters, fueling harmful algal blooms that cloud the water column, choke out marine life, and periodically trigger mass fish die-offs. The oyster reefs were attacking that problem at its biological root. Water clarity around the reef sites began improving measurably within a few years. Dissolved oxygen levels rose. Nutrient concentrations fell. The improvements weren't staying local. They were spreading outward in a widening radius around each site. Clearer water means more sunlight reaching deeper. Seagrass, critical habitat for juvenile fish, manatees, and sea turtles, requires that light to survive. As the reefs cleared the water, seagrass spread back into zones too turbid to support it for years. Then, a second feedback loop engaged. Seagrass stabilized sediment, reduced turbidity further, enabled more seagrass growth. Two self-reinforcing cycles radiating improvements well beyond anything the shell drops had directly touched. Researchers estimated the filtration services generated between 2007 and 2024 were worth tens of millions of dollars in ecological value. Nature was delivering it free of charge. The results didn't stay in Florida. Alabama launched its own shell recycling program by 2015. Mississippi followed. Louisiana initiated large-scale reef-building initiatives. The Billion Oyster Project in New York Harbor adopted the model in one of the most heavily degraded urban waterways in North America. Circular environmental design, repurposing waste materials as functional ecological infrastructure, was reshaping conservation engineering globally. Coastal engineers in Canada, Australia, and Europe began studying the Cedar Key outcomes. But there was one test ahead that no one had designed, one that would arrive without warning. September 2017, Hurricane Irma, Category 4, wind speeds exceeding 150 miles per hour, catastrophic storm surge, waves with enough force to strip beaches and reshape shorelines in hours. When damage assessors moved through the area after Irma passed, they found something that stopped the conversation cold. Shorelines backed by the restored reefs had experienced dramatically less erosion, reduced by 30 to 40% compared to adjacent soft sand beaches. Their dense, irregular, three-dimensional structure absorbed and dissipated wave energy before it reached the shore at full force. Just friction, broken momentum, protected land. Engineers estimated the reefs prevented approximately $3 million in coastal property damage during Irma alone. The total cost of the entire 15-year program came to roughly $5 million. The reefs had nearly paid for themselves in a single storm. Seawalls crack, riprap shifts, steel corrodes, concrete eventually fails. Oyster reefs repair themselves. Storms Storm damage triggers new larval settlement. Each generation adds height and structural complexity. The barrier was growing stronger after every storm, not weaker. Traditional shoreline armoring runs hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars per mile. The Cedar Key program achieved comparable protection at a fraction of that cost and improved every year without additional investment. And the most extraordinary part was still unfolding. By the early 2020s, the reefs had grown substantially beyond their original footprint. On their own, without any human input, the oldest sites had roughly doubled in total area, driven by the oyster reproductive cycle. Each generation settled, matured, died, and contributed shell for the next larval wave. Vertical accumulation, horizontal spread, the reef engineering its own growth on a schedule no human planner had set. Early deposits were irregular mounds of loose calcium carbonate. The living reefs that emerged were architecturally elaborate. Vertical profiles, sheltered passages, overhangs, dozens of distinct microhabitats, crabs, octopuses, sea stars, and juvenile fish simultaneously exploiting different structural features within a single reef section, not sharing a substrate, inhabiting an ecosystem. Dense oyster reefs also sequester organic carbon in their shells and surrounding sediments, trapping greenhouse gases that would otherwise contribute to ocean acidification and atmospheric warming. The ecological case had expanded into a climate case, almost by accident. Biodiversity metrics at the most mature Cedar Key sites were approaching levels recorded at pristine natural limestone reef systems. Endangered sea turtles had returned. Dolphins were hunting reef edges systematically. The Gulf was rebuilding itself around the oysters, and the oysters were rebuilding themselves around the Gulf. Each oyster that lived and died contributed substrate for the next generation. Each generation expanded the footprint, filtered more water, protected more shoreline, supported more species. The intervention had ended. The ecosystem had not. The data projected continuation for decades, potentially centuries. 500,000 tons of oyster shells discarded, written off, tipped into the Gulf without certainty that a single useful thing would follow. Bacteria colonized them within days. Aragonite chemistry reshaped the water. Biofilm fed the first grazers. Juvenile oysters found surface and settled. Generation after generation extended the structure further without being asked. Fish arrived, then turtles, then dolphins working the edges in coordinated passes. Water clarity improved. Seagrass expanded back into zones it hadn't occupied in years. A Category 4 hurricane tested the reefs, and the reefs held, then grew stronger from the damage. The intervention ended. The ecosystem kept building. Should every degraded coastline in the world be running this experiment? Or is the Gulf about to reveal the limits that no one has found yet? Hit subscribe and check out the next video on your screen, because where oyster restoration is headed next is even more extraordinary than what you've just seen.